This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Another episode of Fins, Fur, and Feathers with K-State's Drew Ricketts and Joe Gerken kick off today's show. This week, the pair discuss armadillos and the different methods that can be used for controlling their population. K-State swine nutritionist Jason Woodworth and master's student Jessica Smallfield continue the show as they explain their research involving swine feed efficiency and growth performance. Mike Brouk, K-State dairy specialist, ends today's show with the benefits of using calf blankets on young calves, especially during the first 3 weeks of life. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Tuesday show with another episode of Fins, Fur, and Feathers with K-State's Drew Ricketts and Joe Gerken.
Well, welcome back to another episode of Fins, Fur, and Feathers. And today I think we're going to focus on a critter that, it kind of seems mysterious, but you say they're fairly common. We're going to talk about armadillos today. So I am familiar with armadillos from when I lived kind of down in Arkansas and more so here recently. But growing up in Ohio, I wasn't really familiar with them. So tell us kind of about, what armadillos do we have and are they common in Kansas?
Yeah, so the armadillos are one of those critters that, if you live sort of from the north end of Kansas south, you probably have been seeing them for a while. There's one species of them in North America, but there's a whole bunch of different species of armadillos in South America. So it's one of those species that originated down in South America, adapted into a whole bunch of different species, and really since there's been Europeans living in North America, they've been moving north. That's something that I kind of had always associated with changes in how cold our winters are and stuff like that, was allowing armadillos to move north out of Mexico. But really, if we look at the records, the first ones sort of got into Texas sometime before 1850. And then they started spreading across Texas and into Louisiana by about, the early 1900s, across Oklahoma during that same time frame. And one of the interesting things that's happened recently is there was some genetic work and morphological work on looking at skulls of armadillos in museums, and they figured out that the 9-banded armadillo, which is what we thought we had here, is actually 4 different species. And the one that's in Mexico and on up into North America, they're now calling the Mexican long-nosed armadillo. So I'm just going to call them armadillos. But all of that to say, basically, that we're acknowledging there's a whole bunch of different species of them. But for the rest of the episode, we're going to talk about the Mexican long-nosed armadillo.
For me, it's kind of fun to see an armadillo because they just look so crazy. They have that shell on there. I assume that's a hard, bony type structure to protect them. Is that correct? Just thinking about their looks, they kind of look like they have a turtle shell is what I'd describe it as.
They do look like that. And the thing is, it's not as much of a shell as we might think it is. If we think about like a turtle shell, there's some bone associated with that. It provides a whole lot of protection, and that armor that an armadillo has is there to provide protection, but they're actually dermal plates, so it's basically really thick, leathery skin. And it's something that, of course, a bullet would penetrate, or, if you ran over one with a car, that thick, leathery skin might protect them from, let's say, a coyote grabbing a hold of them from the outside, but it's not going to protect them from a car or a bullet or something like that.
What are some other characteristics that they might have that, just interesting morphology?
Sure. So the skin is really scaly. They don't have a lot of hair on their upper parts. They have more hair down below, closer to the ground, but the species that we have in North America doesn't have a whole lot of hair on the outside of its body. They do have that long tail, of course. From a reproductive standpoint, they're interesting in that, a female has one egg that's fertilized when they mate, and then that one egg splits into 4 embryos that develop into 4 identical quadruplets.
Every time?
Yeah, every time. I mean, they don't always survive every time, but that's what they do when they reproduce, and that's a neat thing that we don't always see.
Are there any risks to humans or any other health effects maybe we should worry about?
Well, that's one of the interesting things that we always need to think about, and armadillos are sort of unique in that they're one of only 2 species besides humans that can host leprosy. Folks that know about that tend to be pretty concerned about it. The thing to know about leprosy is that it's a bacteria that is transmitted to a host from soil that has that bacteria in it. It can be spread from infected animal to a human. It can be spread from human to human, of course, but you have to have that bacteria in the soil in an area in order for that infection to be present in the area. In the United States, it's pretty rare. Yeah. There's some leprosy, or we would call it Hansen's disease, when it's in humans, but 95% of humans aren't susceptible to the leprosy bacteria because our immune systems are able to fight it off before that infection ever starts. But the main thing to know about leprosy and armadillos is if you don't handle an armadillo, then you don't have to worry about getting leprosy from one.
What can we do to help keep populations where they should be?
One of the things that I like to quote from Charlie Lee, who was here before us, is this acronym HER. And that HER acronym stands for Habitat Modification, Exclusion, and Removal. So if we think about options for dealing with armadillo damage that might fall into the habitat modification category, basically we're thinking about cover, food, and water when we're thinking about habitat modification. Armadillos are going to be able to get their water from most of the surrounding areas. If we think about food, one of the things that is oftentimes recommended falsely to folks for critters that like to eat insects and that sort of thing is that, well, if you treat your yard for grubs, then you'll eliminate the food source and you won't have critters like armadillos or moles or skunks digging out in your yard. And the reality is that that's just one of the things that's out there that these critters are eating, right? There's all kinds of invertebrates like earthworms out there. Well, there's not a pesticide that is labeled for earthworms in Kansas. If you put enough of some of the other insecticides down that you're violating the label, then you can kill a lot of earthworms. But if you're doing things legally and if you're being at all conscious of your impact on everything else, then you're not going to kill all of the invertebrates that are in your yard. The main option for habitat modification that can be effective for armadillos is limiting things like brush piles. Similar to that would be sheds with open foundations or sheds that are up on skids. That provides good cover for these sorts of critters to dig underneath to create their burrows. Lining that area that would be open with some pavers or some big cement blocks and that sort of thing can be very effective there. If we think about excluding armadillos, you're probably not going to be 100% effective with exclusion because they're such good diggers that they can dig under fences. The caveat to that is you're making it inconvenient for them to come into your yard, right? They would typically hit that fence, work their way along the fence, and keep on going, unless they can smell something in your yard that makes them think they want to be in there, and then they might dig. As long as they're really tight to the ground and as long as it's a tight fence that's not loose that they'd easily be able to push under, you're going to exclude most of the armadillos from your yard. Removal is, of course, the option that pops into most people's heads the most often. So it's definitely a good short-term solution, but those other solutions might be better long-term solutions to prevent future problems from happening. Removing armadillos can be a challenge. There's no registered pesticide products for armadillos, so if you did try and poison them with something, then that's going to be illegal. Shooting is definitely an option if you are out in the country and you don't have to worry about restrictions on discharging firearms and that sort of thing. Armadillos are primarily nocturnal, but they are active during the daytime sometimes, especially around dusk and dawn. And then the colder it is, the more likely they are going to be active during the wintertime too. thinking about the other option, which is trapping, it tends to be that either a cage-style trap or a wooden box trap is going to be the most effective way to trap them. The problem is that they're not consistently or reliably attracted to any sorts of bait that we have. They eat insects. It's hard to make an insect-based bait. Some folks do have a little bit of luck trapping armadillos with rotten fruit in like a cage trap for bait, rotten bananas or rotten cantaloupe. If it's starting to be really pungent smelling, you can smell that sweet smell from a long ways away, then that can be effective. Other people have tried earthworms that we've bought for fishing that have gone moldy and slimy and that sort of thing. So you can catch some with baits. To make those cage-style traps or box traps more effective, what we can do is what we call drift fence. So we're using a natural barrier, like, let's say, a fence in a yard or a house or the side of a shed. So we're putting our trap right up against that natural barrier, and we're using a double door trap so that they can come in from either side. And then we're taking something else. It could be some fencing material. It could be like a 2x10. And we're placing that at an angle into the mouth of the trap and then going out away from it so that an armadillo is going to hit that object or it's going to hit the house, and they'll follow that right into the trap, and you can catch them that way without having any bait. The other thing that somebody figured out is that after they had caught an armadillo in a wooden box trap, they caught a whole bunch more. And you can take those wooden box traps the first time or two that you use them, then you're going to still have to use drift fence. But once you catch an armadillo in there, they pee and poop, they roll around in there, and so now that trap smells like an armadillo. And those are actually 8 times more effective than a baited cage trap if we're not using drift fence at all.
Once again, that was K-State's Drew Ricketts and Joe Gerken. You can listen to the full podcast episode by searching for Fins, Fur, and Feathers on the podcast streaming platform of your choice or by following a link in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be right back.
You're tuned back into Agriculture Today. I'm Jacob Cloughton for Shelby Varner, and we continue today's show by talking with K-State swine nutritionist Jason Woodworth and master's student at K-State Jessica Smallfield about research being presented at K-State's upcoming Swine Day. Jason, Jessica, thank you for joining the show.
Yep, thanks. We're happy to be here, Jacob.
Yeah, thanks, Jacob, for having us on.
To begin our discussion, Jason, you and Jessica have done some work about lysine to crude protein ratios in a swine diet. Why is that important?
Yeah, Jacob, it's a good topic, and it continues on our research that we conduct here at K-State. And, it is, I'm here speaking with you today with Jessica, but it's a big team that also represented with this research. And, a lot of it comes back to trying to find ways to more efficiently and more economically formulate diets for pigs. And roughly 70% of the cost of raising pigs is due to the cost associated with feed. So we're always trying to find ways to fine-tune that and to be able to make a more economical diet that still allows for pigs to grow at their optimum target growth rates. And so one of the ways that we look at optimizing these diet formulations is by reducing the diet cost. Lots of times from a protein standpoint, we can do that by increasing synthetic amino acids. Oftentimes, though, at the expense of soybean meal or other conventional protein sources. And while that works when we think about the target amino acids that we're adding by removing some of the crude protein from the soybean meal, we also can get into deficiencies on other non-essential amino acids or some of the other active components that soybean meal brings to the diet formulation as well, too. And so as we start doing this and looking at formulating a less expensive diet and adding more synthetic amino acids in by taking out soybean meal, we can get into some imbalances of the amount of amino acids to the crude protein ratio. And that's why we started going down this research aim with a couple different trials that Jessica's conducted.
Yeah, so one of my studies looked at the SID lysine to crude protein ratio using different levels of lysine. So we formulated diets to 1.15 and 1.3 and found that the pigs performed better with the diets that were formulated at 1.3% lysine. And kind of using that knowledge, we also conducted another study looking at different protein sources. So a couple different diets used soybean meal, but then another set of diets used DDGs replacing part of that soybean meal in the diet. So again, looking at those different ratios, but using different protein sources to see if that has an impact on growth performance. And from that, we found that the pigs that were fed the DDG diets, they didn't perform as well. So that kind of goes into the trial that we're going to talk about today, where we had different ratios of SID lysine to crude protein, but we supplemented that with some non-protein nitrogen sources, because as we increase that ratio above 6.5, there's a reduction in growth performance. And so our thought process behind that was, can we bring back feed efficiency by supplementing nitrogen, which becomes deficient when you lower crude protein too much?
Why are the findings of this study important for swine producers in the industry, Jessica?
Yeah, so as Dr. Woodworth mentioned, reducing the soybean meal in the diet is really beneficial for reducing feed costs and also nitrogen excretion. However, when we reduce it too much, it reduces crude protein. And so we have to supplement those diets with synthetic amino acids. And so going beyond that 6.5 SID lysine to crude protein ratio, you see a reduction in growth performance. And so although you're reducing the diet cost, you're kind of taking a hit at that pig's growth performance. And so adding back that nitrogen, we can actually see an increase in that feed efficiency. So based on that trial where we looked at the SID lysine to crude protein ratios and supplementing with non-protein nitrogen, either in the form of diammonium phosphate or glycine, which is an amino nitrogen, we found that there's a reduction in feed efficiency as we increase that SID lysine to crude protein ratio above 6.5 because of reduced crude protein. So we reduce that soybean meal, there's lower crude protein, and so nitrogen becomes that limiting factor. However, when we supplement that with either diammonium phosphate or glycine, those pigs were able to recover that lost growth performance. In addition, we looked at fecal dry matter as well, and so there was a quadratic response where those pigs that were in that intermediate SID lysine to crude protein ratio had the lowest fecal dry matter, and so they had more diarrhea. However, when we add that diammonium back into the high amino acid diet or the 7 SID lysine to crude protein ratio diet, there was an increase in that fecal dry matter, and so there was less diarrhea, which results in just better waste management. There's less slurry production because those pigs have a firmer feces.
So by formulating to SID lysine to crude protein ratio, as well as being able to add in a different nitrogen source, we can reduce the amount of crude protein in the diet. That's important because it leads to less fermentation in the hind gut, less potential diarrhea in the nurseries of these pigs, but it allows us to still have the amino acids and the nitrogen sources available to meet the growth needs of these pigs as they're going forward as well, too. And so it optimizes our ability to allow pigs to grow at the rate that we're desired as efficiently as possible while reducing the amount of potential diarrhea that we'll have in the barns, but also reducing the amount of nitrogen excretion, which is better for the environment in the end of the day.
Jessica, can you provide some more information about the population of pigs used in these trials?
Yeah, so this trial was conducted in Minnesota using a commercial research facility, 900 pigs total. And so we started doing more studies in commercial facilities, just kind of looking at, how do these treatments affect the pigs out in the industry, and how can it be more applicable to producers and the swine industry as a whole?
No, absolutely. And a lot of the research that we do, Jacob, we try and go into the field and work with commercial producers and commercial partners because we can get into barns that are larger populations than what we have here at the K-State level, but also it gets into environments that are more reflective of what they'll be experiencing in commercial production. So the ability to transfer this information to the commercial producers that are in the state and throughout the nation is a lot easier with those populations of pigs to study than what we do sometimes here at the university.
Why did these trials focus on the non-protein nitrogen diammonium phosphate?
Yeah, so we were looking at the SID lysine to crude protein because that's the NRC recommends a SID lysine to crude protein ratio of 6.5, and anything above that, there's a reduction in feed efficiency. And so we started looking at different sources of that non-protein nitrogen to see if we can supplement that nitrogen back into those diets to recover that growth performance. And there's been a lot of studies conducted with monoammonium phosphate, which has a lower nitrogen content. And not too many studies have looked at diammonium phosphate, which has a little bit higher nitrogen content. And so we figured it'd be a good way to kind of see its impact and see if it would be a viable option to recover that lost growth performance.
How can the results of these trials be applied to swine production today?
Yeah, so not only discussing the growth performance part of it, but also talking about fecal dry matter. So we noticed that when diammonium phosphate was added to that high SID lysine to crude protein diet with high amino acids, it actually increased fecal dry matter. And so those pigs had less diarrhea. And ultimately, that's better for the environment because there's less slurry production. We have better waste management. And also, producers don't want to see diarrhea in their barns. It's kind of an indication of sickness. And so when those pigs have healthy fecal matter, it's an indication that they're doing well. But we also looked at serum blood urea nitrogen. So essentially with that, lower concentration's better because a higher concentration indicates that there's excess nitrogen in the bloodstream and it's going to be excreted. And we found that diammonium phosphate and glycine can lower that BUN value. And so that means those pigs are more efficient at utilizing that nitrogen. And that means less is going to be excreted into the environment. Additionally, we looked at digestibility. So those non-protein nitrogen sources increase digestibility, and compared to that high SID lysine to crude protein diet. So when those pigs are better able to digest the crude protein and dry matter, they're able to absorb those nutrients better.
Jessica's done a really nice job with us defining this research area for nursery pigs, but we haven't touched yet on the whole grow-finish pig sector for defining the appropriate lysine to calorie or lysine to crude protein ratio. Actually, one of our PhD students, Ron Navalis, will be heading that up with some research starting here in about 2 weeks, where we'll also define the appropriate lysine to crude protein ratios for pigs from about 80 pounds up until market at about 280 pounds.
Where can interested individuals go to learn more about these trials?
Yeah, there's a lot of opportunities to be able to gain a lot more information on this. And one thing we really want to highlight coming up on November 21st is our K-State Swine Day that'll be happening here on campus in the K-State Alumni Center. We'll have close to 500 people in attendance from all across the nation coming in for this event, and would be happy to have anybody else listening here also join us. The information will be presented there at Swine Day, but it'll also be in some of our research publications that'll be released on that day on K-State Swine Day. Another alternative is you could go to ksuswine.org, our website, and be able to dial in there and be able to find the full research reports of everything we talked about today, as well as all the other research we've conducted within our applied swine nutrition team.
That was Jason Woodworth, K-State swine nutritionist, joined by Jessica Smallfield, master's student at K-State, talking about growth performance and feed efficiency research that will be displayed at the 2024 K-State Swine Day on November 21st. I'm Jacob Cloughton for Shelby Varner, and we're taking a short break now, but stay tuned in because we'll be back with more up ahead.
This is Agriculture Today. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. We end today's program with this week's milk lines. As the days and nights start turning colder, young calves are more susceptible to cold stress. K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk encourages producers to start making plans now for how they'll keep young calves warm, especially during the first 3 weeks of life. He recommends the use of correctly bedded pens, calf jackets, and modifying their feeding program to include more solids.
Today I want to visit with our Kansas dairy producers concerning calf jackets and their young calves. As we feel the cooler temperatures of the fall, we're reminded that very soon now calves in our dairy herds will be suffering from cold stress. You might think, well, not sure about that. Well, the fact of the matter is, based on research trials that have been done over the years, is that calves that are less than a month of age actually start experiencing cold stress when the temperature drops below 50 degrees Fahrenheit. That's their lower critical temperature. At temperatures below this, they actually must use additional energy to support bodily functions and attempt to maintain their normal body temperature. As the temperature drops even lower, it requires greater amounts of energy for them to stay warm. Now, what are some things that you can do as you think about the fall and winter months to protect your younger calves from cold stress? Number one, we have to have pens that are bedded correctly. Calves should be able to nest in the straw. In other words, about 60% of their body should be covered when they snuggle down into the straw bedding that we have provided. That straw bedding needs to be dry as well so that the animals are not becoming wet. Keep in mind that it is very, very important that we keep that hair coat as dry as possible. And if we have wet bedding, those animals become wet when they lay down, and then they can become cold stress quicker than if they have a dry hair coat. Now, some other things you might want to consider doing to help your calves withstand cold stress is the use of calf blankets. Many of you probably do this, so if you haven't dug those out of storage, it's probably time to do that. Make sure that they are clean and ready to go. Calf blankets are very, very important during the first 3 weeks of life when we have colder temperatures. Now, do you start putting them on at 50 degrees? Well, probably not. You need to keep in mind that we're going to have temperatures up and down, so during the day we might be well above 50 degrees, and at night we might slip slightly below that. However, when we start to drop into the 30s and into the 20s, it's time to consider whether or not we want to utilize some calf blankets on our younger calves. Again, the first 3 weeks of life seem to be the most effective in helping the animal withstand cold stress. It's important that you keep an eye on a couple of things if you are using calf blankets. Number one, you need to make sure that the animals are not sweating during the warmer times of the day. Obviously, if they get sweated during the warmer afternoon hours, they're now wet and much less able to withstand cold stress. It's also important that you keep those blankets dry. If the blankets become wet, they need to be removed and a dry blanket put on. It's also important to make sure that you clean these calf jackets or calf blankets in between each calf, making sure that they are laundered and thoroughly dried before we take them to the next calf. This will help reduce the chances that we're spreading disease from calf to calf. Another thing that we need to consider is our feeding program. Increasing the amount of solids that we feed during colder weather will increase calf growth and average daily gain, and will also reduce the number of sick days that they have. Several studies have shown that we can very significantly reduce the number of days scouring or issues with respiratory diseases if we protect our calves from cold stress. This is Mike Brouk with K-State Research and Extension, encouraging our dairy farmers to get prepared for winter and making sure that they have the supplies on hand to help their calves through this critical time.
Thanks, Mike. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.